Do it thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Love is the law, love the will.
Thank you guys for your patience in getting this started a little bit late. This is part one of a two-part lecture on the psychology of Thelema. This is based on an essay that was originally called The Psychological Commentary to Liber Elvel Legis. And if you're a Thelemite that's been around for a while, you might imagine the kind of reaction that some people had to the word commentary and book of the law in the same sentence. So that essay then became the psychology of Liber El, and then no one had a problem with it. So now this is a little bit of that same title, Psychology of Thelema. It's all basically the same content, except I'm here physically incarnate, willing and able to take your questions and comments. This lecture has a lot of information in it, a lot of quotations, because it's about psychology. I want to draw on some psychologists and other fields, even mysticism and religion, that kind of thing. That being said, I would very much appreciate any kinds of questions that come up or comments. Just raise your hand. I can see you, sort of. So I'll look for a waving appendage, and I will call on you. Welcome. Have a seat. Also, I have to say this has been a little wonky while I've been testing it, so if things don't work out totally well, I blame technology. Liber Elvel Legis, subfigura 220, is the full title of the Book of the Law that was a treatise that Aleister Crowley wrote, or received, in Egypt in 1904. This book is the foundation of the philosophical religious system of Thelema. And this lecture is mostly intended to establish Liber El, the Book of the Law, as a valid exposition of human psychology as well. Liber El makes what appear to be many metaphysical and spiritual claims, but we will be examining these strictly in a psychological light, not necessarily in a metaphysical way, in the sense that most religions and spiritualities, or whatever you want to call it, have kind of an established theory of the universe. We'll be looking at those things in terms of modern psychology. I say modern psychology because psychology as a discipline is really, as a separate discipline, is really new in a sense. It's about 150 years old or so. Before that, psychology, which means the study of the psyche, the study of the mind, the study of the soul, these things were basically what philosophers did, and still do, really. Nietzsche called himself a psychologist, for example. He's mostly known as a philosopher. Tons of ideas about psychology, ancient psychology, come from people we consider philosophers, like Aristotle, and so on and so forth. So I will not be really looking at the entirety of human history and all the written literature that was written about what it means to be human. This is about modern psychology and the psychological discipline that if you Googled psychology, this is what you would find. Something like that. I'm going to be drawing upon, in particular, Carl Jung. He is a very useful person to draw upon. I am not a Jungian by any stretch of the imagination, and if you hear weird sounds coming from the walls, please try to just go with the flow, and, you know. So Jung is one psychologist that I find very useful in terms of the framework that he provides, insofar as he's one of the psychologists that really cared about spiritual and religious phenomena and tried to understand them in terms of the human psyche. Welcome, find a seat. So, Carl Jung, and if you ever want sources, I have most of them, just ask. So Carl Carl Jung wrote these very carefully formulated words that characterize the attitude of this lecture and the underlying essay from which it is derived. He writes that the religious point of view always expresses and formulates the essential psychological attitude and its specific prejudices. So if we look at a religion, every religion also implies or formulates a view about the psyche, a view about a psychological attitude. And so, okay, so these quotations are not just kind of colloquial sayings. These are very specifically worded statements. So he writes that psychology treats all metaphysical claims and assertions as mental phenomena, and regards them as statements about the mind and its structure. So any kind of metaphysical claim or assertion, for example, nuit is infinite space, that is a metaphysical assertion. That is understood as a symbol or a statement about the mind and mental phenomena. How? We'll get into that. Alright, so we treat all claims as mental phenomena and regard them as statements about the mind and its structure that derive ultimately from certain unconscious dispositions. This is Jung's theory, of course. It does not consider them to be absolutely valid or even capable of establishing a metaphysical truth. For those that are familiar with the famous line from Liber O, from Aleister Crowley, it's a very similar idea that he's talking about these things, but he's not implying that there is some kind of ultimate, objective, metaphysical truth implied by those statements. So, what we're going for is a psychological perspective on Thelema, or specifically the Book of the Law. What that means is Liber L is seen as describing mental phenomena, or various potentialities of the psyche. What I'm not saying here is that Liber L is only describing mental phenomena. Okay? Liber L describes many different things, but the way we are approaching it in this particular lecture is as mental phenomena, only on this particular plane. Okay? So, for example, just to give one particular example, suppose the book mentioned Earth. Okay? Normally we would understand that to refer to, Earth, the planet. As a mental phenomena, we might understand that to refer to our body, the physicality, materiality, our experience of gravity, our experience of being limited by a human form. These are all mental, personal, subjective phenomena. And that's the plane on which we are taking all these things. It's a somewhat subtle point. Once you get it, it's very obvious. So we'll keep going. Again, I'm very open to comments and questions. Please raise your hand or other appendage. I mean, hey, if I can see it, more power to you. So before I get to this, since we're treating Liber L as a series of psychological assertions about mental phenomena, one might say, oh, they're entirely subjective, which is kind of a meaningless statement if you look into it, but it's really not true. Just as natural scientists, in the sense of scientists that look at the natural world, the external world, they rely upon the uniformity of nature. That's how they derive formulas to describe nature. So too does the psychologist depend upon the relative uniformity of the human psyche to make assertions about mental phenomena. So this is not just subjective in the sense of unique and personal to us. It is actually objective in the sense that many of these things refer to phenomena that are common to all of us. And now this next quotation will describe this common substrate of the psyche that is common to all of us and everyone, theoretically, in the human race. I want you to pay particular attention to this if you believe that Jung's concept of the collective unconscious has anything to do with some kind of weird akashic record that you access, this kind of astral information or anything kind of new agey like that. Jung was actually kind of a hard ass. He really wanted to be looked at as a scientist. If you read any of his lectures, he almost always starts out saying, I've tried to be as rigorous as possible and to be as philosophically skeptical as possible to come to these conclusions. So let's see what he says about the collective unconscious, an idea and a term he coined. So he says, it must be pointed out that just as the human body shows a common anatomy over and above all racial differences, for example, we all have lungs, we all have a stomach, we all have a head, a brain, and the brain has all the same contents for the most part. We're pretty much the same anatomically. That's how we're defined as a species, rather. So we have a common anatomy over and above all racial differences. So too, the human psyche possesses a common substratum transcending all differences in culture and consciousness. I have called this the collective unconscious. So if we called, this is basically saying the collective body of humanity looks kind of like this, with limbs and a head and these organs and the circulatory, pulmonary systems and so on and so forth. He's saying the collective unconscious is the same thing, but in terms of your mind. Your mind has the same structures as everyone else. This is a pretty simple idea that's been taken to mean something that Jung really did not intend, which is that you can, I'm sure you all have heard people talking about the collective unconscious as if it is some kind of magical world out there that we all tap into, or something like that. Jung did not believe that. And if you believe that, that's great, but that's not what Jung meant by this term. So he's called this the collective unconscious. This unconscious psyche, common to all mankind, does not consist merely of contents capable of becoming conscious, but of latent predispositions toward identical reactions. One example is that if you put an infant next to a human breast, they will turn and suckle it. Why is that? Is it possibly because we are all inborn with very similar instincts? Jung believes that is so. Another example would be similar reactions toward maternal figures or paternal figures, and so on and so forth. So what he says is the collective unconscious is simply the psychic, and whenever he says psychic, that does not mean killing goats with mind bullets. It means the psyche. It is an adjective for psyche. Psychic, okay? So the collective unconscious is simply the psychic expression of the identity of brain structure, irrespective of all racial differences. Okay, we all have very similar body parts, we all have very similar mind parts. Very simple. So a way we may, is that a hand?
Yeah. However, how the collective unconscious expresses itself to each individual and to others is through symbology, and that symbology can be very different for each individual.
That's right. That's exactly right, Patrick. Thank you. So to give an example, we all have a mother, even though some of us will try to deny that. We all have a mother, but each of our mothers is very different. We all have images of mother in our brain. That's the collective unconscious. The particular mother that's in your psyche is your personal unconscious. So it's actually very, very similar in a way to some kind of Kabbalistic ideas that there's this kind of abstract idea that then becomes particularized as it manifests, so to speak. Yeah?
And to take that one step further, it's not just different symbols, but we do have the archetypal symbol.
Mm-hmm.
We have the archetypal mother, the archetypal
Right.
father. So, yes, those symbols can be different, but we do have a collective ideal of what that symbol is,
Exactly. Yeah.
generally speaking,
Right.
as a collective human experience.
Absolutely. Yeah. Is there Mary? Is there a hand? Okay. I'm hallucinating. Don't worry about it. So, it's a book of law, central text. This is a psychological perspective. The collective unconscious. So, Liber L can be seen as both the product of and the expression of the collective unconscious, specifically filtered through Aleister Crowley's particular awareness. He had a very peculiar and unique psyche. He even argues that his psyche was most fit to be magus or prophet of this eon because of his breadth of knowledge and his travel and so on and so forth. That's of course arguable in many ways, but the fact of the matter is it was his hand that put the pen to the paper. Okay, so in this way we are treating it as if it is the Liber El, the Book of the Law, is filtered through Crowley's particular consciousness. Right, so this is a psychological way of looking at it. So in the Book of the Law we can find statements of universal import explained under the figure of certain symbols that were familiar to Crowley's consciousness and therefore reproduced by his unconscious in the text. So to give an example, there might be a collective unconscious notion of infinity or an infinite space. When filtered through Crowley's consciousness, it became the infinite night sky of Nuit. As one example. Okay? So we can understand the meaning of various terms and symbols in the Book of the Law and Thelema in general as, hopefully as Crowley understood them, and understood the meaning. We can understand the meaning and purpose in their appearance as if they were from the unconscious, as if they were mental phenomena, not these grandiose metaphysical claims, which they are also, but we're going to keep it to the psychological level. So that's a bunch of words to say that Thelema, or the Book of the Law, puts forward a new point of view about psychology, or a psychological point of view. Any questions so far before I dive into the next part?
Just to
Yeah.
be clear, I guess, we're, in the nature of this lecture, we're not talking about Aiwass at all.
Aiwass would simply be another symbol or expression of mental phenomena. Therefore, he could.
Specific to Crowley's.
Yeah. Well, Aiwass would be a name that was specific to his head, or Rose's head, because she was the one that actually first said that name. So he, in a Jungian sense, it might be an animus figure. It might be many things.
I remember Rose said that name first.
Yeah. Actually, she came up with that first.
Well,
Of course, to extend Jung's and Crowley, the same is true of all belief systems.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a part of the universality of it.
Right. It is true. Right, they'll burn you. Yeah, so a lot of people, the natural reaction to this, and in fact some people perhaps watching now on one of these many technological devices would be saying, oh my god, he's psychologizing Thelema, reducing it to the psyche. Interestingly enough, Jung himself had people levying that exact charge against him from Christians, because he was talking about Christian religion a lot. You know, the religion of Western society, pretty much. And what he said is that he's not making it. This is a very short paraphrase of what he says. There's an entire essay on this, really, I think, in Psychology and Religion, where he says, you know, I'm not reducing Christ and God to the psyche. What I'm saying is that they must manifest through the psyche if we are to become aware of them at all. Otherwise, we'd be unconscious of them. And noting that the human physiology and the human psyche is that amazing that it is capable of perceiving and conceiving of such ideas as Christ, God, and all these things as well. So his point was less that he was psychologizing Christianity or psychologizing religion or the numinous or the divine. He saw it the other way around, where he was showing that the psyche itself was capable of divinity, of perceiving the divine, or of even creating these symbols in the first place, these experiences. So, yeah, I'm kind of the same way. So I don't think that the Book of the Law only refers to things on the psychological level. For example, the Book of the Law talks about fighting for freedom, so to speak, to paraphrase. I do not think, this is pestilence of course, I do not think that only refers to the internal struggle that we all had to fight for freedom. I think that really does refer to fighting for things in the real world. So on and so forth. I gave an example about Earth. Of course that refers to Earth itself. But in this lecture, we're going to treat them strictly as psychological ideas. So we'll stick to the internal struggle and to the psychological notion of earthiness or manifestation. So what is the psychological point of view that the Book of the Law puts forward? I'm glad you asked me. So we have to establish a set of principles to form a kind of functional framework of Thelema within which to work. The principles of the Book of the Law are proclaimed as a dichotomy, much like Taoist concepts of yin and yang, Western concepts of water and fire, and so on and so forth. Nuit speaks, or is the speaker of chapter 1 of the Book of the Law. Hadi is the speaker of chapter 2. They're kind of a dichotomous couple or complements. So we have Nuit and Hadi, we have yin and yang, water and fire. They're understood as infinite space or infinite possibilities and infinite motion. We also, interestingly, have them represented under a very ancient figure, which is that Nuit is the circumference of a circle that's nowhere found, and Hadid is the center of a circle that's everywhere. Okay? So we have imagine a circle with a point in the center, except the point in the center is everywhere, and the circumference of that circle is not found at all.
Sounds like the universe itself.
Indeed. I think that's the idea. Interestingly, that's an identical statement was made by a man named Empedocles in about 500 BC. So this is not a new idea. It's quite old. It's actually been repeated by Christian theologians as a description of the Christian God. Imagine that. So in reality, it's really just kind of a mathematical expression of the idea of infinity in a spatial way. Okay? So, let's see what we got here. We have some images or symbols of these things. So Nuit is the night sky, Hadid is the winged solar disk. You can see that on the stele. She's this night sky arching above everything, and he is this winged disk that's flying through her infinite space. So Nuit is called the infinite in whom we all live and move and have our being, which itself is a reference to the Bible for those that are paying attention. Crowley also says Nuit is all that may be, and is shown by means of any one that is. She's also the total of possibilities of every kind, and she says of herself, I am infinite space and infinite stars thereof. So she represents all possibilities of your awareness, of experience. Yeah.
I just have a question about, in terms of the original Egyptian symbolism of, depicting Nuit as like the archwoman.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's something that I just learned very recently that I've always wondered about, like why a woman might arch over, and that's because we live in modern society and we never see the Milky Way.
Right.
And when I saw that, I was like, oh, duh. Makes
A giant arch of
makes
stars,
a whole lot
yeah.
of sense, But as for Hadith, why? I mean, it makes sense. Like, if you're going with a macrocosm, microcosm model, it would make sense that the sun would, in terms of a solar disk, would be like the microcosm of that night sky. But why the wings?
Well, you'll have to ask Egyptians that. I presume it's because the sun appears to be flying through the sky. And same reason that the sun is a chariot in many mythologies and so on. It's basically this flying orb or eye or whatever that goes through the night sky. And yeah, I mean, it's not just the Milky Way. It's if you look up, it appears to be this thing bending over you. Yeah, so Nuit represents all possibilities that we can experience. And Hadith is, Crowley says, he hath no nature of his own, because he is that to which all events occur. And he is any point which has experience of possibilities. So we have that thing to which events occur, and we have all the possibilities of events. Okay, so we have kind of a perceiver of events, and we have all possible perceptions. So the universe is understood to be made up of complements very similar to matter and motion, or space and time, except understood under the symbolic figures of Nuit and Hadith. In this way, we can see that Thelema posits a universe very similar to our own understanding, the space-time continuum, for example, yet adds a symbolic and almost kind of personal, relatable dimension to these ideas. In this way, Librel, the Book of the Law, it presents a set of symbols for the subconscious to work with. Space and time. Let y'all write that down.
And as Einstein and Planck and other physicists say, it's all the same thing.
Right, yeah.
Space and time are the same.
Indeed.
Just different manifestations.
Absolutely. The best we can do is a hyphen between the words. So, Crowley took this symbolism and he made it the basis of the entire universe. He says that the manifested universe, which is to say, the world of which you are aware, comes from the marriage of Nuit and Hadith, the union of infinite possibilities and the thing which perceives events. Without this, no thing could be. This eternal, this perpetual marriage feast is the nature of things themselves. Therefore, everything that is a crystallization of divine ecstasy. We have two divine infinities uniting to create experience, and all the universe and all that you experience is the union of these two infinite divinities. Therefore, everything is a perpetual marriage feast, which is a kind of a Victorian, nice way to say sex fest of these two infinite divinities. They're constantly in coition to create that which we experience. Coition, that's a fun word, isn't it? So, the first fact of life for the Thelemite is that all things are understood as under this figure of a union or a marriage feast between these two ideas of infinite space, or all possibilities, and that which experiences those possibilities. This is the first major piece of evidence that Thelema, as expressed in Librel, puts forward a kind of psychological point of view of joy as a natural result of existence or experience. Something that we'll touch upon later, perhaps in the next lecture. I can't remember where that is. So essentially a sort of dichotomy is established. We have the perceiver of events having no qualities in itself, which we call Hadith. And each one of us, at the core of each of us, is Hadith, that perceiver of events. Boom, that point that has no length or width, it's a mathematical point. Imagine that at the center of your awareness. That which perceives everything. So Hadith is the perceiver of events. In all events that can be perceived, or the field of perception, all this stuff that you guys are seeing and experiencing right now is Nuit on the psychological level, the microcosmic level. This may seem very far-flung, but it's a perfectly acceptable model of psychological reality, or phenomenological reality, the way in which we experience the world. Okay? A very similar statement occurs in something called the Bhagavad Gita. the most famous Hindu scripture. Okay, it says in there, whatever exists, whatever exists, animate or inanimate, is born through the union of the field and its knower, Hadith and Nuit. It's also very remarkably similar to the ideas of a certain psychologist called Carl Rogers, who had a very awesome middle name, Ransom. Carl Ransom Rogers. He was the president of the American Psychological Association. He created client-centered therapy. When you hear people talk about therapy as if the therapist just goes, "Oh, and how does that make you feel?" You can blame Carl Rogers for that. He's very important. So he described client-centered therapy in 1951. This is 4 years after Crowley died, which in some ways is a long time ago. In other ways, it's entirely after everything that Crowley did. So Rogers has this really cool thing where he delineates 19 propositions that describe his system of therapy, and which really encompass his entire theory of the human psyche. Okay, so the very first proposition is this: he calls us organisms. That is his term as to refer to us as a coherent whole. So all individuals. Oh my God, there's a typo. Ignore that, please. All individuals or organisms exist in a continually changing world of experience, which he calls the phenomenal field, of which they are the center. Okay, he's making a very simple claim that we all exist in a field of perceptions of which we are at the center. Is that true for all of you? I think so. You're not like on the left side of your perception or on top. You're usually in the center. Okay, so the Thelemic way to say that is that the individual point of view, Hadith, exists in a continually changing phenomenal field, Nuit, of which he or she is the center. So, in fact, Carl Rogers says the best vantage point for understanding behavior is from the internal frame of reference of the individual. I would say that Thelema, in a way, preempted this kind of psychological view, which we take so much for granted today that it seems so painfully obvious that if you want to understand someone, you should understand them from their frame of reference. But this was not an entirely common view, even back to Freud, where, to oversimplify things, there was the authority that knew more about you than you did, and they would dictate that truth to you, and you would go to them for that truth. People still do this with medical doctors, rightfully so. But to understand the person and their world, you should understand it from their perspective. Okay? Radical view, I know. Respecting people's perspectives. This is a field that viewed homosexuality as a mental illness until about 1964. So, not entirely proud about that, but there's still a ways for us to go. The fact that Crowley was kind of understood that it was a natural expression of human nature way back in 1904. Perhaps our medical and psychological fields are slowly catching up to that. Mary, first.
In medical libraries, when you go to look up illnesses, they have all these amazingly wonderful, interesting illnesses. And my favorite one at the time was being a woman. And that was up until the mid-60s, that being a woman was a definition of disability.
Yeah. You guys in your hysteria. Patrick?
Actually, the phenomenological viewpoint goes back to William James in the 1880s, 1890s. He was the first one to really look at the phenomena of the individual and realize that that's different for each person.
That's right. William James is also the author of a book that I would recommend you all read, which is called The Varieties of Religious Experience. It is one of the best books on this subject, and it was written in something like 1901, and it's still crazy relevant. I think it starts out with like the neurology of religious experience, for it to be like that ahead of its time. It's pretty insane. And yeah, they're definitely phenomenologists. There are psychologists that have been accepting of things like homosexuality and of phenomenological points of view for a long time. The general field is pretty slow because, you know, things move conservatively and so on. So, moving on to the next thing. Everyone believes things if Albert Einstein says them, so I thought I would put a quote from Albert Einstein. This is from Mein Weltbild, which means my world picture, or my worldview, which is a very cool word, in my opinion. He says, the really valuable thing in the pageant of human life seems to me not the state, but the creative, sentient individual, the personality. It alone creates the noble and the sublime, while the herd as such remains dull in thought and dull in feeling. It's almost like Nietzsche wrote that.
And to put it into historical perspective, that was the time of the rise of fascism.
1931, yep. Definitely was.
2 years before Hitler took power, was the fascist idea of the state as being supreme.
Absolutely.
Had already been propounded by Mussolini in Italy.
Yep. And Albert Einstein was a German Jew. Many people believe those things don't exist, but I'm one of them as well. So they do exist. So, too soon. So each person is a star with a will. This is very kind of introductory material, but it is very crucial in terms of establishing the principles that we believe in Thelema, and that can establish a psychological point of view in terms of what the Book of the Law says. So after a couple proclamations, there comes one of the most important statements of Thelema. Every man and every woman is a star. So here's the first indication that the Book of the Law may not be literal.
Unless you're in Hollywood.
Well, it makes for a good show. Why not? It's very interesting that people have no qualms taking the first and second chapters to be symbolic, and then they assume that the third chapter is entirely literal and concrete. I don't understand that kind of bifurcation. I think most of it is symbolic and literal in many ways, but I do not think that human beings are stars, literally. So Crowley says, by this, and by this we mean that line, we mean we are all free, all independent, all shining glorious, each one a radiant world. Interesting that he used the term world. I believe he's referring to the fact that we are not just these things that are perceiving a world from which we are separate. What we have is an experience of the world, a perception of events, a being in the world, as Heidegger might say, in that your being is inseparable from that world. Your hadith is inseparable from the nuit. The perceiver is inseparable from that which is perceived. And what we have is not an individual kind of eyeball or something like that. We have a world, a universe, a manifested universe, the universe that you experience. I might be extrapolating a little bit too much. That was just one word, world, but I think that is what he's referring to. Yeah.
Just in terms of the literal interpretation, I'm assuming Crowley wrote this for ayahuasca vendor before the science had an idea of the Carl Sagan thing about it being named star stuff.
I'm not sure when that came around, but I've not encountered Crowley saying much about that, except kind of an older idea that the Earth itself was the crystallization of the sun's fire, like the chilled spark of the sun. But I do think it predates our knowledge of that, especially, in planetary formation, that kind of thing.
He came up with, I keep wanting to say Carl Rogers, but it's not Carl.
Sagan?
Carl Sagan. Popularized that in the 1970s.
Yep, Cosmos. Hail Sagan.
He's ahead of his time again.
Well, that sort of fits though. I think your exposition is a better fit because otherwise it would be every man and every woman and every bug and every snail and every piece of garbage is a star.
Yeah. They're Buddhas, but they're not stars. Just kidding. Okay. Go ahead and say something. He also says that this line implies that the individual is the autarch. Autarch is a word that means self-ruler, kind of like auto and, say, like monarch or something like that. So, the self-ruler. We are in charge of ourselves, is what we might say. So in the same sense that the sun, which is a star, by the way, is the center of the solar system in the physical macrocosm, every man and every woman is understood to be a kind of microcosmic star or the center of his or her own system. Okay? So we have this idea that a star is an individual identity. Each of you, it radiates energy, it goes, it's a point of view. Its object is to become the whole by establishing relations with other stars. Each such relation is an event. It is an act of love under will.
I've never heard that book.
That's an essay. It's in the Revival of Magick, which has a bunch of his unpublished essays. He actually didn't even finish this essay, so the end is a bunch of notes. And the notes themselves are really cool, in my opinion. But yeah, check it out.
What
So-
year was that roughly? Like this essay?
What, 1920 or so? A lot of the Revival of Magick are like 1915 to 1925 or so that was a total guess, but yeah. Yeah.
Is the acts of love under will basically the same, that establishing relations with others is your choice and it's your
Yeah.
free will,
Right.
just existential sort of,
Yeah, I mean,
like in some.
we'll get into this, but the essential idea is love is a union between two things. So the relation between two stars is love. Under will means that it fulfills the nature of those involved. Theoretically, me lecturing at you is a relation between myself and yourselves as stars. Theoretically, you came here as a free choice of your own, I hope, and that it fulfills your nature or purpose in some way, which presumably could be understood to learn more about Thelema, or to learn more about myself, and so on and so forth. Fulfills my will because I like talking at people. So each individual is an aggregate of events or experiences. And we each constantly change with each fresh event, which affects him or her either consciously or subconsciously. Interesting choice of psychological terminology, isn't it? We'll find that Crowley himself co-opts psychological terminology quite frequently. Why? Because I think it's very useful to describe the kinds of things he was attempting to explain. So certainly from a psychological standpoint, it could be understood that we're centers of our own universes and we're aggregates of experience, which is another way to say we have memory. We aggregate experiences. Let's see what we got here. So a little bit more, So stars are self-luminous. It's a symbol that means that we derive our power and our strength from ourselves, not an outside source. Also, stars are constantly in motion, in interacting with the gravitational pulls of other stars and other systems. So it also implies that we're constantly intertwined with everyone and everything. A very simple symbol has far-reaching implications. Okay, so we're each stars. What about this whole like hadith thing? Well, hadith is the flame that burns in the heart of man, in every heart of man, and in the core of every star. So we have the star, this experience of the world, and we have hadith as that kind of point at the center of this star, that center, the core of that star. So Crowley talks about hadith, and he says, he, hadith, is then your own inmost divine self. It is you, and not another, who are lost in the constant rapture of the embraces of infinite beauty, even though you know it not, for the most part. So, some of us do in our best moments. Nuit commands us, be thou hadith, my secret center, my heart and my tongue, which is another way of saying we are very intimately connected with divinity. We are the divine. This is an incredibly common idea in Eastern mysticism, that if anyone is familiar with any form of it, it will seem commonplace, okay? But it also occurs in a lot of Western ideas, especially the mystics. There's one who is a saint of our Gnostic church, known as Miguel de Molinos, and he is very fond of a very similar idea, which is to say, thou art to know that thy soul is the center, habitation, and kingdom of God. These, in my opinion, these lines say very similar things. One uses our terminology, another uses Christian terminology, the kingdom of God. That, I believe, is something like the very first verse of his entire book. And every man and every woman is a star is the third line of our book. I think they're very similar.
As Keith said, that did not go over too well for Molinos.
Yeah, most Christian mystics didn't do too well. So in a word, by asserting that every man and every woman is a star, we assert both the individual sovereignty and their divinity. Just as physical stars have their unique course in the span of space, each individual is understood to have their own unique will, or motion, or orbit, or direction, or purpose, or many other words. In fact, Thelema itself means... So Thelema means will, and it's the foundation of our entire philosophy. Here's 3 lines. If you didn't get the message, it's repeated. So, Thelema means will. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole law. There is no law beyond do what thou wilt. Thou hast no right but to do thy will. This will thing is pretty important in Thelema.
But what is will?
It's a good question. I think I might get into that. So, these statements very clearly establish that everything revolves around this kind of dictum of do what thou wilt. As Crowley often noted, this does not mean do whatever the hell you like, but it is a command to perform what we often call your true will, or what the Book of the Law calls your pure will. The Book of the Law proclaims, thou hast no right but to do thy will. Do thou and no other shall say nay. So we can see a kind of a general point of view of existence formulated by Thelema. It's kind of covered in all these obtuse words and symbols, but it's actually quite simple. Each individual is a star, the center of their own universe, and their sole right and duty is to perform their will, which is to find their motion and to stick to it. At the core of this star is Hadith, that perceiver of events, and about the star are infinite possibilities, infinite possible experiences that you unite with. So each person is performing their unique will amidst Nuit, infinite space, infinite possibilities. So since will is quite important to Thelema, we might want to understand how a Thelemite is to will things. Liberal talks about something called pure will. I'll note, for those who have heard me say this exhaustively, that the Book of the Law never says true will. In fact, true will does not occur in any holy book of Thelema. It occurs in a bunch of Crowley's writings, that's for sure. But if you are a hard-ass, purist, kind of person, you might assert that pure will is actually the more technically correct term, because it actually occurs in the book. I think true will is a useful concept, and perhaps slightly different from pure will, but we'll kind of gloss over that. So this is a line from the Book of the Law. It says, pure will, unassuaged of purpose, delivered from the lust of result, is every way perfect.
Here, here.
So for will to be considered pure and every way perfect, it theoretically must be unassuaged of purpose and delivered from the lust of result. So Crowley actually explains what these phrases mean to him. This is helpful because unassuaged of purpose is almost a meaningless English phrase. It does not conform to normal grammar, which the Book of the Law often does not. But as people who are fans of poetry may know, ambiguity of language encourages a multiplicity of interpretations, which in itself is a valuable thing, to have many layers of meaning and interpretation. So Crowley says there's two different meanings of this phrase, unassuaged of purpose. The first is more obvious for those who know what unassuaged means, which is that will itself is impeded or weakened by purpose. And the will is meant to go on its way unrestricted by these notions of purpose. So to assuage something or someone means to make it less, to calm it down. So unassuaged is not bothered by something, not impeded by something, not brought down by something. So this is kind of interpretation of it saying unassuaged by purpose. So it is unimpeded by notions of purpose, which is to say mental, intellectual formations of what purpose one should be doing. Ironically, most people speak of will as a purpose like this. It is my will to do X. That is exactly that kind of thing that it's talking about, that impedes. It's a little more nuanced than that, but we'll get there. So the mind and reason are generally understood to be an obstacle. They're understood to be an obstacle to a full expression of your will. We'll talk about that idea in particular a lot coming up. So unassuaged of purpose means we don't get bogged down, at the very least, in these ideas of what it is we should or should not be doing. Interestingly, Karen Horney, who is a psychologist, has a phrase, the tyranny of the should. I believe this is almost identical, in a way, to what Crowley is trying to get at here. These notions, these intellectual conceptions of I should or should not be doing these things, or what the purpose is, actually impede the full expression of your nature. So, definition number one of ambiguous phrase is unimpeded by purpose. And purpose is in quotes there because one could say he did it with such purpose, which means he did it with great intensity, very focused, and so on, which is not the same meaning as I have a purpose for doing this, and that purpose is blah, and you can kind of articulate that in a logical proposition of some sort. So that's why it's purpose. It's an intellectual, verbalized purpose. That can,
what Karen said again.
I can't catch it.
Tyranny should.
Okay, I couldn't hear, but it sounds like you got your
Nice.
answer.
Thank you.
Thank you, audience. The second definition is with tireless energy. Or what he's saying is of purpose unassuaged. Okay, so remember when I said he did it with such great purpose. Now he's taking that and saying that, but not assuaged, not limited. So it's basically saying unimpeded by these notions of purpose, but also with great purpose. Lovely and contradictory. Once you're a master of the temple and you abide above the abyss, you can let me know if that makes any sense. It's actually very, very similar to a lot of Eastern conceptions. Technically, the language is different, but Wu Wei has a very similar notion, idea as what they're getting at, what he is getting at in both of these things combined. There's also a lot of different phrases in Zen that, excuse me, refer to essentially the same idea, which is unsurprising because Zen was very strongly influenced by Taoism.
Yeah, I was just thinking of the Tao as being a tireless energy because it's the right way to do it, which is, of course, the wrong way to express it. Also, we held a Czech with an unpronounceable last name.
Oh, yeah. Mikhail Chikoslovakian.
That's the one.
Yeah.
The flow.
Talks
Yeah, exactly,
about
the flow
being
guy.
in the flow in which the whole universe coalesces around what you are doing
Yeah.
to achieve a goal. But again, that is with purpose. And I don't think that this is the only time I've really heard a will separated from purpose.
Mm-hmm. Fun. Yeah, I can't pronounce that guy's name either, so I can't tell you who it is, but I know his first name is Mikhail, and his last name starts with the letters CZ. So good luck. He wrote a book. He wrote many books, but he is famous for the concept of flow, which is often attributed to kind of a balance between doing something really difficult and something you're very skillful at. So he takes kind of like master instrumentalists and sports players, they get into a state of flow. I'm sure you've all experienced this to some extent in your own lives while doing something that you feel like you're pretty good at.
When you're in the Tao.
When you're in the Tao, you become the way. There's many parallel concepts to kind of this unassuaged of purpose idea. Interesting that it occurs in the Book of the Law with 3 words, and there's an immense amount packed into those 3 words. Good thing we have another phrase, delivered from lust of result. So, I would say that a summary of Crowley's commentary is that delivered from the lust of result means to be unaffected by or unattached to the results of one's actions or the desire for those results. In more Eastern terminology, non-attachment to the fruits of your action. This is almost a direct quote from the Bhagavad Gita, actually. Crowley likens it to an aphorism, art for art's sake. Do it for the thing itself, not for the reward. Alright? In case you didn't believe me, here's the Bhagavad Gita. Those whose consciousness is unified, okay, who attain this kind of mystical trance, they abandon all attachment to the results of action and attain supreme peace. But those whose desires are fragmented, interesting, who are selfishly attached to the results of their work, who have a lust of result perhaps, are bound in everything they do. Those who renounce attachment in all their deeds live content in the city of 9 gates, the body, as its master. Yes?
Could we maybe attribute this large idea here to the Fool? Like
Sure.
that path?
Yeah, I think the Fool is a very, very lovely image of all these ideas kind of combined. Especially the Fool that's about to walk over a cliff. He's just going his way, regardless of what potential catastrophes there might be. Someone once defined Wu Wei as, I have to get this exactly right, otherwise it won't make sense. Not striving, but nonetheless conquering. And I think that's a very beautiful, elegant way of describing this kind of idea. Yeah.
I've heard someone here describe that concept of art for art's sake, or delivering to the rest of the result is also like that you have the right to your labor itself, but not to any results.
Right.
May or may not come from it.
Yeah.
Okay.
It is, yeah. And it's also from things like The Vision and the Voice, where it describes the master of the temple The work of the master of the temple is to tend the garden, and there's a line in there that says, "You can tend the garden, but you won't see the reward." The joy is, this is paraphrased, the joy is basically to tend the garden, not to get literally the fruits of that garden.
The destination is the journey.
Right. Yeah. It doesn't fit too well into kind of a capitalistic paradigm where the result is the thing of worth, but yeah. Indeed. Nice Libre Alex Swede shout out there. So, yeah, we got the Bhagavad Gita. So this is from something called The Message of the Master Therion, which is about a one-page document that Crowley wrote, and he finally figured out what it is he wanted to say. And I think this quote is the essence of what the Message of the Master Therion is. He says, there's two things you need to do. Thou must, 1, find out what is thy will. 2, do that will. Okay, we need some more information, Crowley. How do we do that will? Well, we do it A, with one-pointedness, B, with detachment, and C, with peace. Then, and only then, art thou in harmony with the movement of things. Presumably some kind of corollary to, say, the way, or the Tao, or something like that. Thy will, part of, and therefore equal to, the will of God. And since the will is but the dynamic aspect of the self, and since two different selves could not possess identical wills, then if thy will be God's will, thou art that. One of his crazy syllogisms that doesn't really hold up, but if it's kind of poetic. So he's saying, if you do this, you are in harmony with the will of God, and therefore one with that will of God, and therefore you are God. Which is a fancy way to say, just worry about your own will. Okay, let's make it more confusing. Introduce more terms. Love is the law. Love under will. You've all heard this at least once before. This is a very important concept. I would say that it is not what we would consider the emotion of love or the emotion of kind-heartedness. Crowley writes in this very same document, while that's not the right quote. Okay. Well, so he writes, while in the Book of the Law is a lot about love, there's no word about sentimentality. Hate itself is almost like love. So he's saying hate is an expression like love, or hate is an expression of love. I would say that's because hate is an experience. It's a relation between two people. There's a famous quote by an anonymous source that the opposite of love is not hate, it is apathy. I think that is a very similar idea, that hate is still a relation between two things. It's caring about something, it's interacting with something, and therefore is a form of love or union. So instead, love refers to all acts whatsoever. Any change in conformity with will, so to speak. Where does this, I can't even find where this quote occurs. Let's just go through it. So while will is the law, Thelema is the law, the nature of that will is love, what we sometimes call agape. So the nature of will is love. But this love, as it were a byproduct of that will. It does not contradict or supersede that will, and if any apparent contradiction should arise, it's the will that will guide us aright. So basically Crowley is saying, do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law, and the nature of that will is love. But don't get too hung up on love, because really it's will that guides you aright. It is the way that will functions is through love, but will is our central concept, yeah.
With hatred being almost like love, do you think it'd be fair to unpack that kind of, like the way I think of it initially is like if you hate something is bad, like discrimination or prejudice or like poverty or something, that hatred is born out of your love for your fellow man or something. So what can I say?
Sure. What I'm saying is not that, but that your hatred for, say, poverty is establishing a relation with poverty. It is acknowledging it. It's interacting with it somehow. That interaction is itself love. It does not come out of sentimentality. I mean, it may come out of your love for mankind, but that love for mankind is simply one subset of love, which also includes hate. Yes.
On this same topic, I've always been curious about this, and I don't know which quote it is in the Book of the Law, but it's talking about there is love and there is also love, and to not confuse the two.
Yeah.
Is that kind of
There's the dove and there's the serpent. Choose ye well.
where there is love and there is also love?
Yeah. I'm not going to comment on that line. That one's very tricky for a whole host of reasons. But I would simply say that all emotions are subsets of this idea of love. Our emotional love is simply the same word. It's this union with other things, union with experience.
Very Aristotelian.
Aristotelian. In fact, a lot of mine was very Aristotelian. But yeah. So, So the modus operandi, the way we operate as Thelemites, can be summarized as love under will. This is what we do. This is what stars do. They love under will. Okay? In this psychological sense, love means for the hadith in you to unite with a certain instance of nuit, to have an experience. So you fulfill one potential of the infinite potentials of existence. Say, right now, you're sitting there watching me. That, in fact, is an example, right now, of love under will. And you are presumably assimilating that experience and not completely dissociated, or you're actually a zombie and you have no awareness, which I would never know, but yeah. So each of us are assimilating experience in accordance with our will, with our nature. Oh, there we go. Hate itself is almost like love. So Crowley says every event, every moment of your awareness is a uniting of some one monad, hadith, with one of the experiences possible to it, nuit. And each motion or action is an act of love, the uniting with another part of nuit. Interesting that he puts it in quotes, as if he truly understands. It's a symbol for something. Each such act must be under will, chosen so as to fulfill and not thwart the true nature of the being concerned. So, while love can refer specifically to acts of union in the sense that sex is an act of union on the physical plane, samadhi is an act of union on the mental plane, these are, kind of quintessential symbols of union. But love refers to all acts of union, all experiences. It is a much more universal notion. And it even includes acts that we consider to be division, like hate. It is still an experience. So, now we can understand that there really is no law beyond do what thou wilt. And love is the law is basically what we're here to do, is to assimilate experience in accordance with our nature, to further fructify ourselves, to further gain satisfaction, to experience the joy of union, of experience itself, and to come to know ourselves. This concept mirrors Carl Rogers' propositions in a really crazy way. these, again, are from his same 19 proposition thing that is stuck in an appendix of a 600-page book that you'll never find. So you'll get it here for free. He says that, again, this is pretty amazing that he says these things, I think. The organism, when he says organism, you can kind of switch in star for our Thelemic terminology, or each individual. The individual has one basic tendency in striving: to actualize, maintain, and enhance the experiencing organism. Let's neglect that he has 3 verbs when he says it's one thing. He's trying to get at a single idea. We are all trying to actualize our potential as an organism. We're trying to make manifest that which is potential.
Is this pre-Maslow or about the same time?
It's pre-Maslow. It's 1951. Maslow was 56 or something.
Yeah.
It was right after it, but this actually did come before Maslow's major works. And they collaborated to create both humanistic psychology as we know it and transpersonal psychology. Maslow was more on the transpersonal side than Rogers, but they did work closely. And existential psychology to some extent, actually, for those who care. So yeah. So the organism has one basic purpose. He calls this the actualizing tendency. That's his term, what we might call the will. The one condition that's important from the standpoint of Liber Legis, the Book of the Law, is that our acts of love must be done under will. Under will can be understood as this: that which actualizes, maintains, and enhances you, your organism. It's a way to define under will. It's a very useful and simple, straightforward way of defining will, in my opinion. So he goes on and gives even more cool stuff. He says, he basically tells you what a successful love under will looks like, and what a failure of love under will looks like. And he calls these psychological adjustment and psychological, I believe, maladjustment. So these are still the propositions. He says psychological adjustment exists when the concept of the self is such that the all sensory and visceral experiences of the organism, sensory refers to all senses of which you can perceive, visceral means basically of the body. So he's saying, he uses very biological, physical terms. I'm not sure exactly why, but that was his way of speaking. He's saying psychological adjustment exists when your concept of self is such that all of your experiences are or may be assimilated on a symbolic level into a consistent relationship with the concept of self. What a crazy idea. I'll just go to this one and then go back to it. Psychological maladjustment exists when we deny awareness of significant experiences, which consequently are not symbolized and organized into the gestalt of the self-structure. When this situation exists, there's a basic or potential psychological tension. So a perfect example of maladjustment, a kind of classic example would be trauma, where someone experiences something so horrible that they can't even integrate it into their experience. They can't think about it, they can't symbolize it. If you try to ask them to talk about it, they break down, they can't talk, that kind of thing. That is kind of a classic, stereotypical version of maladjustment. Psychological adjustment occurs when you are able to assimilate that experience on some level, as a symbol, as words, whatever. Presumably what you're doing right now, because for those of you that are not already totally overwhelmed, in which case you are doing the second thing. Yeah, any questions about psychological adjustment or psychological maladjustment? It flips into psychological language pretty hard, so I understand that it might be a little hard to grasp.
I was just going to say, perhaps Rogers was so keen on using the biological jargon so that he would be labeled a wild agnostic like people would use human being.
Yeah. It's kind of the same nowadays, where to have credibility you say, you know, the neurological substrates of this are, or something like that. yeah, people, psychologists have been using kind of propaganda to get their message across since they started. So.
You might define Gestalt for people.
A Gestalt is a collection of things in a coherent whole. Gestalt psychology is its own whole thing, mostly created by someone named Fritz Perls, who is a crazy badass. He's so fun. There's a beautiful video where the same person has therapy with 3 different therapists. One of them is Carl Rogers, and one of them is Fritz Perls. She talks about her. This is a sidebar, but Carl Rogers. You see Carl, and he's going, "Oh, wow, that must have been so hard.
They're still
I really feel for you." And then Fritz Perls comes on. Fritz Perls comes on, and the woman is telling the same story, and Fritz Perls goes, "And are you a 10-year-old girl anymore?" And no. Then why are you acting like a 10-year-old girl? And it's just like such a hard ass, such a dick. Interestingly, the woman was interviewed afterward and asked which one was most effective for her, and she said Fritz Perls.
Who was the third person?
Adler, I think.
The therapy was very effective.
Yeah.
I think that
Gestalt is still here. What?
Carl Rogers were like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. It just makes you feel worse." It's like, "Oh God, thanks. Now I'm gonna cry."
The way,
more."
so Carl Rogers' way is kind of like the prima materia of that whole idea, and it's become much more nuanced since then. But the idea that you have to have empathy for your clients is kind of such a radical idea, but it is useful when it's not kind of
Cutting Gestalt into the Thelemic framework, it is Hadith. It is the totality of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And that the human,
That's Gestalt, yeah.
that all animals have the ability to choose their needs from that totality,
Mm-hmm.
to meet their needs.
Right.
One of my favorite examples is you're driving down San Pablo Boulevard and you're hungry. How many tire shops do you see? None. But if you're driving down it and you've got a flat tire, how many restaurants do you see?
Presumably
Lots and
none.
lots of tire shops, but no restaurant.
Right. Yep, that is the foreground idea of Gestalt. Yep. Indeed. Alrighty, so this whole idea is basically a psychological way of saying love under will and sucking at love under will. I'm being kind of glib, but it's a failure of love under will, a failure to unite with an experience, to see it as it is. The major point here is denies awareness. So the terms that we're familiar with are denial, right? People are in denial of something. That is an example of maladjustment. They won't admit that something is true. Mostly because it's harmful to their concept of the self. Right? Nietzsche has this lovely phrase where he says, "My memory says I did. My pride says I did not. In the end, my pride wins." And this is actually, Freud cites that as a source for his concept of repression. And it is essentially the same idea. Your concept of self cannot integrate that sensory or visceral experience because it's such a threat to it. It would mean that you built it on these false premises and so on and so forth.
Do you know who coined that phrase, that which you resist persists?
It sounds American because it rhymes, but I don't know.
And you say, everything that I do not wish to do, I do. I mean, it's been around. It's human nature.
It is.
Sweet. Thanks, Group.
So occasionally I throw in quotes just to pretend like there's scriptural authorities for these things. This one's Swami Vivekananda. He's a really awesome guy. If you've never read Raja Yoga by him, I very strongly recommend it. It's totally a sidebar, but he said all love is expansion. Okay, we can see this as kind of uniting with experience, expanding out to meet it. All selfishness is contraction. Love is therefore the only law of life. That's sort of familiar. He who loves lives. He who is selfish is dying. Therefore love for love's sake. It's almost like art for art's sake. Because it is a law of life, just as you breathe to live. Did Crowley read Vivekananda? Yes, he very much did. Not saying that's where he got it from, but...
Who was also a Westerner, right? No?
Who?
Like that?
Who am I thinking of that like took
Who was the first to come to the West?
a guru name when he was actually a native from the US?
Every person named Swami after about 1950.
Particularly in America.
Vivekananda is very, yeah, he traveled over here. He's kind of the Hindu missionary that brought all those ideas originally to the Chicago World Religion Conference. That's still going on, actually. So we have about half an hour left. What if we got through another section of this? Who wants to talk about sin?
Yay!
So this is basically the notion of sin abolished. This is the psychological point of view of the book of law. Remember that? So Crowley writes, the formula of this law is, do what thou wilt. It's almost like he had a single message that he tried to get across in doing it. Its moral aspect is simple enough in theory. Do what thou wilt does not mean do as you please, although it does imply this degree of emancipation. That it is no longer possible to say a priori that a given action is wrong. Each man has the right and an absolute right to accomplish his true will. So the main point I want to emphasize here is it's no longer possible to say a priori that a given action is wrong, let alone sinful. Each person has an absolute right to do their will. So in Thelema, one is enjoined to do what thou wilt, as we've seen, and this will should theoretically be pure and perfect in every way, of course. It be performed with tireless energy, without regard to notions of purpose, without lusting after results. Another diversion or veil from this pure will is what we might call conventional morality, especially this notion of sin. In Judeo-Christian Islamic terms, the world is viewed in terms of good and evil, with good actions being those that adhere to specific laws set forth in whatever book is holy or good, and evil is breaking those laws. So Thelema is a philosophy or a point of view that our Saint Friedrich Nietzsche would have termed to be beyond good and evil. Anyone ever read that book? Let me rephrase. Anyone ever tried to read that book? For anyone that did not raise their hand, I recommend it very strongly. The only restriction in Thelema is to be diverted from your will. It's very simple. In fact, the line right after do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law is?
Love is the law.
No. The word of sin is restriction. Actually, that comes 17 lines after do what thou wilt. Yeah. Crowley explains this line very succinctly, in my opinion. He says, this is a general statement or definition of sin, or error. Anything soever that binds the will, hinders, or diverts it is sin. Okay. Here's a very new view of ethics, where the only evil is to divert from your will. What is your will? Only you can say what that is. That's a very radical idea, that only you can pronounce what is good and what is evil for yourself, especially for 1904. Okay? Nowadays, it's kind of a platitude. Each person, you're on your own trip, man. You know, we have this idea in a million different ways. It's kind of the plot to every Disney movie of the last 20 years. Be yourself, that kind of thing. But it was quite radical at the time, and it still is radical in many ways. In case you haven't noticed, people such as Christians and other old eon religions are still trying to legislate their morality and impose it upon us. Even today. If people have heard of these religious liberty laws, for example, that are being passed. Anyone that follows the news, I'm sorry. But it's real, and it's happening, and it's 2016 right now of the vulgar era. And this is still important, that we need to fight for this freedom. So, psychologically, we could say that when you deviate from your true inner promptings, a conflict arises that we call neurosis. So Carl Jung defines nervous disorders, which is kind of an old school way of saying neurotic formations or neurosis. He says nervous disorders consist primarily in an alienation from your instincts, a splitting off of consciousness from certain basic facts of the psyche. You can see how Carl Rogers' idea fits right into this, that you split things off from yourself, you can't handle them, they're too offensive to your notion of self, and that tension, he even said it creates psychological tension. That is what Jung called neurosis, or what he defined as neurosis, rather. So generally when an action, a thought, or a tendency arises that's contrary to society or religion's view of what is right, the psyche tends to suppress and prevent those unlikable aspects from appearing to the conscious mind. I'll use homosexuality as a very easy example. If your society and your peer group says that being a homosexual is evil, and so on and so forth, you're a disgusting sinner that will burn in hell forever because of that, chances are you won't allow thoughts of homosexual desire or anything like that to even arise. You'll push it down and push it out of awareness. It'll be suppressed, repressed. It's a very simple idea that we're all pretty much familiar with. So although they may not appear consciously to the person, the same tendency will still exist in the unconscious, and it will still exert its influence. To go back to politics, how many politicians have proposed laws against, say, public proposition for prostitution, and then themselves been caught doing that exact act which they were legislating against? How many times? Way more to count. Enough that Crowley has a line in Book of Lies about this very idea, that people preach the good law because they look inside themselves and see nothing but sin, and they must assume that everyone else is exactly as sinful as themselves, so they legislate against it. That's a paraphrase, of course.
Which chapter is that in Book of Lies?
I don't know, but I remember that he says they preach the good law. So Google that phrase. So basically, we suppress natural tendencies of things that are not in line with society's expectations. And that's the basis of psychological repression. In Thelema, these repressions are understood to be what they are understood for what they are. Repressions of your natural inclinations, and therefore sin. So if the sole law is to do your will, artificially repressing aspects of yourself leads to a disastrous split in your psyche, and therefore a split in your will. If you deviate from your will, you're creating a split in yourself that is equivalent to having multiple wills. Wills that diverge and conflict. In psychological terms, you could say a fundamental split of the conscious from the unconscious in the individual. So,
taken to extreme becomes multiple personality.
Sure, yeah. I would say that the common result is that you have no personality. No real personality. No real opinion, no real stance. So Crowley writes something which is a little intense, but he says, Thelemites are thrice born. We accept everything for what it is without lust or result, without insisting upon things conforming with a priori ideals or regretting their failure to do so. We can therefore enjoy all things of sense and rapture according to their true nature. So the main point here being that we try to see things as they are without imposing these ideals that are formed just in the air. You know, to stay with the homosexuality one, homosexuality is bad. That's an a priori ideal. It's something you just hold a priori without any priori. So what we do is we try to acknowledge things as they are and accept them as they are. without forcing them to conform with a priori ideals or regretting their failure to do so. That basically describes everyone's consternation with everything in the world. So it's a pretty big concept. But there you go. Yeah, so I've already talked about sexuality in terms of homosexuality. It's a very easy one to talk about because culturally we used to view it as evil, and now generally, especially in the Bay Area, of course, we are very accepting of that, so it's a useful example. But the most evident application of the idea that the word of sin is restriction is in the sphere of sexual morality. Every religion has innumerable restrictions upon sexual life, especially for women. Liberal proclaims not only that every man and every woman is a star, showing their essential equality, that they all have sovereign wills, but also take your fill and will of love as you will, when, where, and with whom ye will. If this line does not look radical to you, you have been in the Bay Area far too long. This was written in 1904. That was 112 years ago that this was written. So learn history. That's an intense thing to say. Maybe Iwas was the intense one for saying that, but yeah. So I would say this line is very strangely prophetic of the way our society went after this. In particular of the sexual revolution that took place in the 1960s, over half a century after Liberal was written, in the groundbreaking research on sex by a psychologist named Alfred Kinsey. Anyone know Kinsey? Ever heard of the Kinsey scale? Anything like that? Alfred Kinsey was actually physically at the Abbey of Thelema in Sheffield.
Really?
Yeah, with Kenneth Anger. There's a lovely photograph of that I totally should have had it here, but sorry about that. But he was there. You can take my word for it. A priori. So, in Thelema, there's no restrictions, even to relationships of love, that may be even these things that were considered sinful, like homosexuality, or sodomy, or masochism, or sadism, or anything like that. What?
He wants polyamory.
I left out infinite possible designations of sexual relationships. Yeah, so non-monogamous, non-heteronormative things, anything, really. So a thing is wrong to a Thelemite only insofar as it has brought you to deviate from your nature, from the expression of your will. Crowley says that we have no right to interfere with any type of manifestation of the sexual impulse on an a priori ground. That's a very radical thing to say, especially in Victorian England.
It's almost the kind of thing that would make you go to exile.
Yeah, indeed. Might get banned, kicked out of Italy or something. Some more quotes. So he says, yeah.
It does assume that it is mutual.
It does, indeed. He's talking kind of on I believe on a philosophical ground here, but of course, under will means to fulfill the nature of those involved. Crowley's basic definition actually does include consent. There's a lovely quotation where he lays that out very, very clearly, that each party must know the full implications involved. Okay? Our modern term for that is consent. Oops.
Quick question.
Oh, that's backwards, yeah.
On the fractured self thing a few slides ago.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, like, was the idea of the existence of like a self-healing intelligence, was that around in psychology in Crowley's day, or was that something that came along later with like Jung?
I'm not sure. Self-healing intelligence?
Like in terms of like the psychologist or the doctor not being the one that can heal you, like you have to do it with you yourself.
I mean, I'm sure there are predecessors or antecedents to that. I mean, there's a line in the Bible that says, "Physician, heal thyself." I'm sure it goes back a very long way. What's that? Yeah.
I keep thinking about one of the definitions of love, the manifestation of the universe copulating and enjoying itself and becoming, that love is also interaction. And in one level, I think when I read the Book of the Law, the take your fill and will of love is also beyond restriction of bodies and of individuals. That's partly that you fully manifest into your own flow work, that you fully engage with love with that work that you're doing.
Right.
And to remember that love is not just fucking.
Right.
I love fucking. I love that we're a sex cult, and love is so much more
Yeah.
than flesh.
I like to say that everything is symbolic of sex, except sex, which is symbolic of everything.
Nicely done.
Did you coin it?
I hope so.
There was another version of that at some point.
There have been
where it
many.
ended with except sex, which is symbolic of death.
Yeah, that's way less
Yours
clever.
actually works better.
Yeah, way less clever.
Perhaps less.
All right, so let's keep going through this. We only have a few minutes. Love under will is the law. Again, it's like he has the same message repeated in every frickin' place that he writes. We refuse to regard love as shameful and degrading. Fuck yeah. We refuse to regard it as a peril to the body and soul. We refuse to accept it as the surrender of the divine to the animal. To us, it is the means by which the animal may be made the winged sphinx, which may bear man aloft to the house of the gods. It's divine, in other words. So the sexual instinct was obviously repressed without mercy in the religions of the past. It's often decried as animalistic or sinful. Thelema turns this on its head by saying, not only is sex not shameful and degrading, it is the natural function of the human being, and if it's in accordance with their will, it divinizes or deifies those people. It makes gods of them.
No wonder he was considered the most evil man in the
such a
Victorian
wicked
world.
man. How dare you love each other? All these people not feeling degraded about themselves. This is dangerous.
What was the sentence that said, if it is not against the will, what is the following? Sorry. It said like sex is not shameful if it is not against the will. Something like that. I'm just.
You mean this quote here? Or, we refuse to regard love as shameful and degrading as a peril. We refuse to regard it.
I don't know.
Well, I was just riffing. So
Okay,
it's in the ether now.
Okay.
It's recorded.
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
So he summarizes these sentiments when he says it should be abundantly clear from the foregoing remarks that each individual has an absolute and indefeasible right to use his sexual vehicle in accordance with its own proper character, that he is responsible only to himself. So psychologically, this is theoretically a healthy route to take. Crowley wrote that sex repression leads to neurosis and is the cause of social unrest, which is a hilarious statement if you think about it for a while. He thinks sex repression leads to social unrest because people are not fucking enough. I just really enjoyed that sentence.
Also very Jungian.
Yeah, indeed. So, let's see. So Alfred Kinsey wrote that sexual desire is a basic biological urge, drive, or instinct that demands satisfaction. If the sexual drive is denied legitimate outlets, it will find satisfaction in illegitimate ones. Repression of sexual desire may lead to physical or mental illness, especially neurosis. He says neurosis in women. Love that. And the need for sex is as basic as the need for food. This is a radical idea in 1954, whenever that was, that sex is a biological or a natural need that we all have. But he said it, and I think Crowley's talking about this is very much in line with Kinsey's research and everything that really came after it.
Bill Hunt made that point as well.
Right, yeah. Yeah, the FBI was not fond of his work. They burned a lot of his books, in fact. So we have a quote here: "Repression of the natural satisfaction may result in the addition of secret and dangerous vices which destroy their victim because they're artificial and unnatural aberrations." That's a Victorian way of saying exactly what Kinsey just said. That if you don't fulfill it naturally, it'll have to come out in these weird ways. He thought that meant abuse and that kind of thing. Rape and abuse. The sexual urge is being unsatisfied in a natural way. And so people will find horrible ways to make it manifest. It's the same really with food. If you are starving, you may actually kill someone to get food. And shit. So on and so forth. So, by proclaiming the word of sin as restriction, we say that the only sin is to repress the will. The idea of restriction extends into that of sex morality, but it really refers to all acts. Sexual morality is something that was of particular importance to Crowley, especially in the context of Victorian morality, coming out of that whole stodgy era, especially in England. But it really refers to all morality. So this even refers to, say, stealing, harming others, and all those other things that are referred to in ethical systems. So, do it thou wilt in the word of sin is restriction. They apply to all morality. We had the quote that it's no longer possible to say a priori that a given action is wrong, and that each man has an absolute right to accomplish their will. Crowley also writes there are no standards of right. Ethics is balderdash. It's a lovely sentence. Each star must go on its own orbit. To hell with the moral principle. There is no such thing. So this is an attack upon this idea that we have an innate moral principle. That moral principle happens to conform with 19th century British Victorian morality, of course, and therefore is imposed upon everyone else. He's saying there are no standards, there is no moral principle, there is no absolute standard of anything. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole law. In this sense, Thelema shows somewhat of a form of ethical relativism, one might say. Each person's right or wrong is in relation to their unique nature and circumstances, their unique will. Now here's another Swami Vivekananda. In reality, good and evil are not different from each other. Good and bad are merely conventional terms. Depending on how it's used, the same thing can be good or bad. Take, for example, this lamplight. Because of its burning, back in those days, I know you guys don't understand this, but lamps were made of fire, and fire gave off light. So take this lamplight. Because of its burning, we are able to see and do various works of utility. This is one mode of using the light. Now if you put your fingers in it, they will be burnt. This is another mode of using that same light. So it's clear that a thing becomes good or bad according to the way we use it. The same is the case with virtue and vice. Broadly speaking, the proper use of any faculties of our mind and body is virtue, and their improper use is vice. Kind of a circular way of defining ethics, that the right thing to do is the proper thing to do, of course. But I think his point is very simple, and it boggles my mind that it took so long for people to kind of come to this conclusion that things become good or bad in relation to their particular context. Yeah.
But he's still talking in terms of morality. Improper use is vice, which is immoral. And proper use of the facilities, who defines it? Even if you define your own proper use, you still have to live in a consensual world. You still have, I may decide I want to drive on the left side of the road.
Right.
Everybody else is going to collide with me.
Right. One might argue that's an improper use of your faculties, or one might say, go for it and suffer the consequences.
Yeah. Well, but there is a reality that exists beyond that, that does pass judgment.
I
You
acknowledge
can
that
only
believe
jump
that.
so high before gravity grabs you and pulls you back.
Right. You're saying that there. Yeah. Let's have someone else respond.
As much as this quote fits our needs, Magick was no Thelemite, and he would be happy to tell you which are the Trump.
Right. Yeah. Especially for the end of yoga, but yeah. I think the point
is absolutely necessary in the survival of India.
Yeah. So at no point does Curly ever say there's no such thing as good or bad. In fact, he says quite the opposite. There are good and bad, but only you can define those, because only you can know which fulfills your will and which thwarts your will. Those are good and bad for you. That's more. That's morality. That's moral. That is not amoral. It is relativistic morality, but it is still proper and improper. For him to say love under will means something and not another thing is essentially a moral statement. That it has to fulfill your nature is a moral statement. But it is individualized and unique in accordance with your particular nature. Well, that's funny. I thought I wouldn't even really go for 2 hours this time, but you guys have many interesting comments and questions and input. I'm going to stop here for this time. It is approximately 9:24, so we stopped 6 minutes early, but thank you guys for coming and for engaging so much. I really appreciate all the comments. And so next time we'll talk about some fun stuff, including the curse against reason. It's a lie, just to cut it short. We'll talk about individuation and the true will, Jungian individuation and how true will is an expression of that individuation. We will also be talking about a psychological mode of failure that exists in the Book of the Law. And we'll talk about some really crazy stuff like life and death instincts, how they're in the Book of the Law, how Freud obviously stole them from the Book of the Law, and so on and so forth.
Part 2 is next week, right?
Part 2 is next week, same time, same place, same channel. And while I'm still up here yelling at you, this is a lovely golden bowl of donations. In case you have trouble, the arrow is to tell you the direction those donations should go in. Layla is there watching you and judging you.